Hello, Nasties, and welcome to She Who Persisted, the Nasty Podcast. I'm Elizabeth with my co-host. Well, this season, I don't have a co-host. And actually, you'll notice a couple of changes this season. The first, and let's just address it right off the bat, Beatrice is busy. She has another podcast in German called Große Töchter that looks at feminist issues in Austria, and she's very busy with that. In addition, she also needs to finish her dissertation, so she'll be focusing on her job, her other podcasts, and her dissertation for this season. She'll be coming to visit as a guest host here and there in the course of the season, but we'll have other guest hosts as well, and we'll have interviews with people who are doing some amazing work, amazing feminist work, amazing intersectional feminist work, and who are just all around amazing people. One thing you might also notice this season is the episodes are a bit shorter. We got some feedback from listeners that the episodes just were too hard to digest all in an hour and a half, 2 hours. So instead, we're going to split our longer conversations into shorter episodes. One other thing you might notice this season is that there might be a few more ads. We're trying to strike a good balance. If any of the ads ever seem to be in conflict with what we're trying to do as feminists and what we're trying to do with our podcast, let us know and we'll remove the ads immediately. It's always most important for us that we remain true to our interests as feminists and supporting feminist causes. I think that's all the housekeeping we have. So let's get started with the episode. Today we begin a 2-part interview with Historian Mar Hicks. In honor of Women's History Month and the 30th anniversary of the internet, we thought it would be great to bring on a historian of gender and computing. Mar's first book, Programmed Inequality, investigated why the proportion of women declined as electronic computing matured and the effect that this had on technology in Britain. Their new research project investigates the exclusion of trans individuals in algorithms and is really interesting. Mar has some really great recommendations for books and articles to look at if you're interested in the intersection of gender and technology. So stick around toward the end of the episode for recommendations on books. Like I said, this is part of a 2-part interview. So in this episode, we're looking primarily at their research, which is super interesting. And in the next episode, we look at the contemporary situation with gender and computing, what we can do, how we can persist. And it's not all bleak. There are people doing some really great work to help raise awareness and fight the patriarchy. Thank you for joining us for this, our inaugural episode of this season of She Who Persisted, the
She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted.
Thank you for joining us. So do you want to go by Marie or Mar? And can I ask you your preferred pronouns?
Sure. Well, I use they, them pronouns, and we can use Mar for our purposes here. That's generally what I go by. If people are looking for me online, my professional scholarship and stuff like that, they'd have to Google Marie Hicks, perhaps.
Okay. And so first, I'm going to ask you a really broad question. Can you introduce yourself and your research? So give me basically your 30-second elevator speech about your research.
So first, thanks for having me. And I'm Mar Hicks. I'm an associate professor of history at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, Illinois. And I do the history of computing primarily. And what I'm really interested in is gender and labor and trying to figure out how, for instance, like computing going from being feminized to masculinized really changed things in the field other than just for women. And right now I'm working on a book about the deep prehistory of transphobic algorithmic bias.
That is super interesting. What does that entail? I mean, I know that there's a lot there and you're just getting started on the research for it.
Yeah. It's still in the early stages, but what it entails basically is going back and algorithmic bias is in the news so much today. And so it's a very pressing and current problem. And there's been a ton of great sociological and information studies research and research coming out of a lot of fields. However, I feel like history hasn't done the greatest job of showing how this is not a current problem. This is something that has existed for decades. It's something that has existed as long as computers have existed. And I think that once we can show people that, then we can show how this problem has snowballed. And we can also kind of, get people to the point of realizing this didn't happen by accident. These were intentional choices made over long periods of time for specific reasons by people in power. And that's why we have these systems that we have today. So it's not about like asking Mark Zuckerberg to please make things better or something. This is a huge systemic historical problem and we have to address that. And so that's kind of my goal in writing this.
And so does it address how computing and algorithms can be transphobic, even because they're not really value neutral, right? These algorithms.
Yeah, you're totally right. They're not value neutral at all. And the thing is, folks always want to give, I guess, the benefit of the doubt to the machines that pervade their lives, right? Because if we don't, it's terrifying. But in fact, we have to look at how we look to machines, and we look different depending on what race we are, what class we are, what gender we are, whether we are trans or not, whether we are disabled or not, all of these different categories. And so the part of the book that I'm working on right now has to do with one particular example of how the British government tried to apportion kind of like what we would consider social security benefits to trans people in the 1950s through 1970s. And it kind of hinges on this one thing that I found in the archives that shows that prior to the British computerizing their big social welfare system, there was actually more accommodation of trans people who were writing to the government, telling them that they needed their records corrected, essentially. And after computerization, the government actually used that as an excuse to say, the computer doesn't see gender, only numbers, so we're not going to accommodate trans people anymore, all the while continuing to track them through the system, saying internally that the reason they wouldn't accommodate trans people was actually because they consider them perverts and they didn't want to give them sort of a tacit approval. And then, most tellingly, programming the mainframe computer that apportioned these benefits to actually kick known trans people's accounts out of the processing chain. So actually cause a programming fault, a processing error when one of these accounts came up, kick it out so it had to be dealt with manually, which caused it to be subject to greater scrutiny, greater oversight. Each of these moments was a moment for that person's worthiness to get benefits to be reevaluated. They were not allowed to just go through the machine as a man or as a woman. They were always marked as different.
It was basically computer othering of individuals.
I love the way you put that. That's exactly it. That's precisely what it was.
Wow, that sounds like a really, really interesting project.
Thanks.
Your previous research project and your monograph that came out was called Programmed Inequality, and it kind of investigated why the proportion of women in computing declined as computing matured and the effects that this had on the technology sector in Britain. Do you see this erasure of women from histories of science and technology, or do you see an erasure of women from histories of science and technology and labor? I mean, our podcast is all about persisting and resisting patriarchy. What do you see as the best ways as a historian to counter this?
I think you're 100% right that the history of women in computing and many other fields of work in particular, but in lots of different areas, it's one of erasure, and it's one where, in fact, even the records that have been kept obfuscate how many women were there, what they were actually doing, what the relative importance of that was. And you see this in a lot of different contexts. But the thing that's really interesting to me about computing is that it starts out feminized. And as it automates, it becomes more male identified. And that's unusual. That's the reverse of what normally happens. Usually as a field automates, it gets seen as de-skilled and it starts to feminize. So computing's a little weird in that way. And then, of course, because I worked in computing for a while and my mother was a computer programmer, and obviously computing is really, really important today and really high status today, I started out wanting to learn more about the field's feminized, de-skilled, or I'll put de-skilled in air quotes, origins. And at the time, this was back in the early 2000s, there really wasn't very much written on it. And so I decided, you know what, I'll write about it. And then, the rest is literally history, because now, of course, everybody actually cares about this. And there's been an explosion of books on the topic.
Well, sure. I mean, your book came out at a really important moment, I feel like, in our discussion about women in technology. The film Hidden Figures had just come out, and we really started acknowledging kind of the unsung sheroes, I would say, of the early technological innovation. And you were specifically looking at Britain. Hidden Figures looked at African American women in the U.S. context. What lessons can we draw from the case of what happened with women in Britain and maybe the American case as well?
Sure. I really lucked out because, as you point out, my book came out the same year that Hidden Figures exploded onto the scene. And Margot Lee Shetterly even was kind enough to blurb my book, which was like, that's like my brush with celebrity. Yeah. And she's so nice. I met her at a conference once, and her work is so important. I always say to people, like, if you've seen the movie and you haven't read the book, definitely read the book, because the book, don't judge a book by its movie. The book does things that the movie just can't. It doesn't have room for. It isn't interested in doing. And the movie's fine. It's entertaining, but the book is really a great institutional history of NASA and of this particular class of workers within NASA. And the really fascinating thing and sad thing, and this goes back to your question about erasure, is that even though there were hundreds of these women, they were not really known to exist. And Margot Lee Shetterly, she knew they existed because she grew up in their community. And when she started working on the project and looking for funding so she could do this research, people disbelieved her. I've got to imagine they were white people, but she's talked about how people and funders actually disbelieved that these women even existed, or at least existed in any large numbers, enough to be the subject of historical research. And I ran into a little bit of a similar thing with my own project, but one of the reasons I actually work on the UK is in part because of the availability of records, because all of the UK companies that I was looking at are now defunct pretty much. And so I could get at their records. The US companies from that period, like IBM, for instance, they're still going strong, and they don't want anybody looking too closely at their records.
Well, of course not.
So there's a definite issue there. And then I have to say, like, now there's a lot of tech critique about Silicon Valley. We're undergoing, what people call the tech lash, right? Yeah. And it's like now okay to critique Silicon Valley. But I started this project right after the first internet bubble, when people they'd been given a little bit of a push to look at Silicon Valley as maybe not as great as they assumed, but they still thought this is going to be the next great thing. And direct criticism of Silicon Valley was not really an option, especially since after the first tech bubble, there was this idea that, oh, well, we've learned our lesson. We won't do that again. Right. And so I thought that, let's look at a very similar, historical cousin of ours, which was a fading empire, sort of in a similar